Having some technical difficulties with the House recording studio. There's no sound going out. If you give it just 1 minute, we will let you know when everything is ready on their end.
Say again?
We just got word we're okay to resume.
I'll start where I left off there. We're holding this hearing virtually in compliance with the regulations for remote committee proceedings pursuant to House Resolution 965. Remote hearings certainly aren't the same as sitting together in our committee room, but this new authority has allowed us to continue to do our work on behalf of the American people while keeping our staff, family, and broader communities safe. This is the second official virtual subcommittee hearing in the Ways and Means Committee. As with our previous hearing, I want members to know that I plan to continue this committee's long tradition of collegiality and substantive debate, even as we conduct our business from afar. I will continue to work with our ranking member and his staff to ensure that the rights of all members are respected in this new virtual format. So before we turn to today's important topic, I want to remind members of a few procedures to help you navigate this new platform. First, consistent with regulations, the committee will keep microphones muted to limit background noise. Members are responsible for unmuting themselves when they seek recognition or when recognized for their 5 minutes. Second, members and witnesses must have their cameras on at all times. If you need for any reason to step away from the proceeding, please leave your camera on rather than logging out. Finally, we have several members who are waving on to the subcommittee for today's hearing. I'll recognize subcommittee members on a bipartisan basis in order of seniority, followed by off-subcommittee members in order of seniority for questioning our witnesses. I thank you all for your continued patience as we navigate this technology in order to continue serving our country together in this great time of need. With that, I'll now turn to the important topic of today's hearing, the consequences of inaction on COVID tax legislation. Federal tax measures from the CARES Act and the Families First Coronavirus Response Act played a critically important role in sustaining workers and families during the COVID-19 pandemic. The economic impact payments, the employee retention tax credit, together with the supplemental federal unemployment insurance benefits, helped millions of families weather this year's economic catastrophe. Over the course of a few weeks this spring, more than 21 million jobs evaporated, and millions more were scaled back to fewer hours and less pay. Gig work dried up. Almost overnight, we went from the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years to the highest unemployment rate since the Great Depression. From one end of the country to the other, people found themselves with no paychecks in the middle of a public crisis. Hitting the pavement to find a new job was not only risky, but mostly futile because the jobs just weren't there. In February, there were 8 unemployed workers for every 10 available jobs. In April, there were 46 unemployed workers for every 10 available jobs. People need help quickly, and I'm proud of how our Congress and the administration stepped up. We did our jobs. The EIPs and the Employee Retention Tax Credit played an indispensable role in helping Americans make it through the deepest economic catastrophe of our lives. They helped families feed their kids. They helped keep a roof over tens of millions of citizens' heads. They helped Americans continue to pay their bills while they were unable to work. Finally, the job retention credit helped people hold on to their health insurance during a global pandemic. At the time we designed these measures, we didn't know for sure how deep this recession would be or how long it would last. There was a lot of optimism about a V-shaped recovery that would quickly bounce back to its previous high employment levels and steady growth. We know now that those hopes were overly optimistic. Instead of a V-shaped recovery, we're seeing a K-shaped recovery, with some sectors and groups recovering fast and others forced to wait, while getting worse off day by day. 94% of the jobs in financial services are back, but millions of people in hospitality, retail, manufacturing, and food service still have no work. People of color, women, and workers with less education are experiencing a much slower recovery than others. It's been 6 months since the pandemic struck the U.S. in earnest, and 6 weeks since the expanded unemployment benefits lapsed. Millions of families have exhausted their savings and their EIPs paying for necessities, food, housing, utilities, health insurance, and car payments. It is painfully clear that millions continue to struggle, and the hole they are in is getting deeper by the day. According to census data for July, 13 million adults couldn't pay their rent. 29 million adults, sometimes or often, didn't have enough to eat over the past week. And 1 in 3 kids did not get enough to eat because the household couldn't afford it. Think about that. 1 in 3 kids not getting enough to eat because their families can't afford to feed them. The economy was broken earlier this year, and we took extraordinary measures to try and protect families during the crisis. Well, millions of families and millions of children are still in crisis. That's why the House passed the HEROES Act on May 15th, approving a second round of EIPs and other support for struggling families. For 4 months, the Senate has done nothing to help these families. Today's hearing will examine the real-life consequences of this inaction. And with that, I'll recognize the ranking member, Mr. Smith of Nebraska, for the purpose of an opening statement. Mr. Smith?
Thank you, Chairman Thompson, for calling today's hearing on the consequences of failure to complete the next round of COVID legislation. And before we begin, I would like to take a moment to join you in acknowledging the terrorist attacks which took place in New York City, Pennsylvania, and in Washington, D.C. already 19 years ago today. We came together as a nation then, just as many Americans have come together now to support their neighbors during this current pandemic. Today's hearing provides us a great opportunity to reflect on areas where we agree and also to assess how much the Speaker's my way or the highway approach to economic relief is actually failing Americans. Republicans stand ready to work on yet another COVID relief package, and we hope the Democrats share this call. Sadly, throughout this pandemic, House Democrat leaders have stalled each relief package Congress has passed. And as recently as yesterday, we saw Senate Democrats block a smart, targeted relief package that would have given our children, small businesses, and healthcare workers the help and certainty that they need. Let's be clear. Any package that makes it to the president's desk must be bipartisan. The Senate Republican bill was a chance for Democrats to come back to the table. Over here in the House, though, we have only one proposal from the majority party, and that HEROES Act, as it's called, makes no attempts at being bipartisan and stands no chance of becoming law. And part of the reason why is because that bill failed the first litmus test lawmakers must ask when we write these relief packages. Our first question should be, what measures will be most effective in defeating this disease and helping Americans safely return to work and to school? Not simply, how are we going to spend $3 trillion, as the Speaker has proposed? That is the question Republicans are focused on finding answers today. And I also want to thank our witnesses for being here today who will help us find an answer. We will hear from Mr. Colicchio about the increase in food insecurity in the past 6 months. Prior to the pandemic, we were making progress on increasing food security across this country. Earlier this week, USDA reported that food insecurity was at its lowest level in over a decade in 2019, helped by the strong economy fueled by tax and regulatory relief. We also know American ag producers are the most efficient in the world and stand ready to feed their neighbors now and in the future. And although that isn't in the jurisdiction of this committee, Republicans agree we can and should do more to help the neediest Americans have access to nutritious food, particularly during this difficult time. Ms. Long will be sharing with us her story of losing work because of the pandemic, receiving enhanced unemployment benefits, and finding a new job. We share the view that our small businesses back home and even Democrat governors across the country are telling us that we need to fine-tune the short-term unemployment payment created as part of the CARES Act so we can reconnect the unemployed with our job creators who still have good-paying jobs to offer. Dr. Stevenson also opens her remarks by highlighting the importance of our efforts to maintain connections between employees and employers. Mayor Morial will highlight for us the housing challenges created by the pandemic. I appreciate the president and his administration taking decisive action on evictions. This was needed action, but we also know that our housing situation needs a much more comprehensive solution than merely banning evictions. And while housing also is not in this committee's jurisdiction, any policy we pass needs to be bipartisan and focused on helping those most in need. Banning evictions alone doesn't address underlying costs such as insurance, taxes, and mortgage payments, which landlords must still pay. And the threat of our economy is great if these commitments are not met across the country. And finally, we will hear from Mr. Brill about steps we can take to help employers safely reopen and keep employees on the payroll, including expanding the employee retention tax credit and providing assistance with cleaning and social distancing. We need to address the challenges before us today, and we need to plan for the future so that if another pandemic hits, we are prepared. Already, we are experiencing one of the fastest economic recoveries on record. There is still progress that needs to be made. We are not yet out of this pandemic. But we cannot secure short-term or long-term growth for our workers unless we work together, Republicans and Democrats, Congress and the White House, toward a solution. Republicans here today are ready to engage. Mr. Chairman, we ask that you and House Democrat leaders choose to work with us so that we can get our families and small businesses the help and the certainty that they need. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Without objections, all members' opening statements will be part of the record. I want to thank our witnesses who have joined us today. We have a distinguished group of individuals who have taken time to come and meet with us and give us a firsthand understanding of what's happening on the ground. First, Dr. Betsy Stevenson is a respected economist who will help us understand the condition of the labor market now, during the pandemic, and the important role that extending the HEROES tax relief measures could play in our economy. Mark Morial is the former mayor of New Orleans and the current president and CEO of the National Urban League. Mr. Morial will testify about housing insecurity arising as a result of the pandemic and how low-income families and people of color are disproportionately experiencing housing insecurity as a result of the pandemic and the recession. We all know Tom Colicchio as the chief judge of Top Chef and the owner of several prominent restaurants. But Mr. Colicchio is also a longtime activist on food security and childhood nutrition. He will testify on how the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated longstanding issues with hunger in America. Nikita Long is a single mom living with her 2 younger children in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Until the pandemic struck, Ms. Long had been working in manufacturing jobs her entire adult life. But then she was laid off due to COVID-19. The economic stimulus payments, her federal tax refund, and the federal supplemental unemployment benefits helped tide her family over through the worst of the pandemic. And she is starting a new job this week at an Amazon facility. But even so, her family is facing the loss of their home and other economic aftershocks of the pandemic. And finally, Alex Brill is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies the impact of tax policy on the U.S. economy, as well as the fiscal, economic, and political consequences of tax, budget, healthcare, retirement security, and trade policies. Each of your statements will be made part of the record in its entirety. I ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes or less. And to help you with that time, please keep an eye on the clock that should already be pinned to your screen. If you go over your time, I will notify you with the tap of the gavel or the yellow pen. And Dr. Stevenson, I'm going to ask you to begin, and you may proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Thompson and Ranking Member Smith.
Before you do, though, I ask unanimous consent that Dr. Stevenson's corrected testimony be entered into the record. The changes came last night, and they've been reviewed, and they're only a typo and spelling changes. There's no content change. So without objection, such will be the order, and you may proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Thompson and Ranking Member Smith, for the opportunity to appear today. I want to begin by commending you on the swift action that Congress took in March in passing 3 bills that together provided spending and tax provisions to support American families and businesses. Fiscal policy works best when it's timely, and the policies enacted in the CARES Act were just that, timely provisions that allowed many people to keep paying for housing, food, and other essential items. The families that suffered and continue to suffer the steepest declines in income are among those least prepared to fill in for lost income. The result was a steep fall in spending and thus GDP in the spring. Yet thanks to your efforts, household incomes rose in April, and in return, retail sales rose strongly in May. The worst of the pandemic was not over in May and is not yet over, but fiscal policy meant that the worst of the downturn was. In a normal recession, you might take the growth in jobs since April as a sign that we are on the right path. You would be mistaken to make that inference now. The growth in jobs and retail sales reflects a return to jobs that have not been lost, and the public health knowledge that is allowing some businesses to successfully reopen despite the ongoing pandemic. And again, is directly because of your efforts last spring. I urge you to focus not on the changes, but the levels of our current situation. 13.5 million people unemployed, more than 11 million jobs still lost, and roughly 30 million people receiving some form of unemployment insurance. Together, these numbers make it clear that there is a staggering ongoing shortage of jobs, hours, and customers. I want to assure you that we have done the easy part at this point. That's why it's been so quick. We put people back into jobs they already have. Our current path of job gains will not continue, indeed is already slowing. We are simultaneously witnessing businesses trying to reopen safely and bringing employees back to work, while others are realizing that there is simply not enough demand for their product in our current environment to maintain their payroll. We've lost roughly 400,000 businesses, and that hemorrhaging of businesses has not stopped. Underneath the return to work, there's been growing permanent job loss. Permanent job loss is much harder to reverse than a temporary layoff. Without further action on your part, American families will continue to suffer, and the rest of the recovery will take years to complete. Let me emphasize, years to complete, and it's possible we will not return to our pre-pandemic potential trajectory for decades. The HEROES Act has many important provisions that would play an essential role in preventing extreme hardship among American families and stabilizing the economy and putting us on a path toward greater prosperity. I'm happy to answer questions about the specific provisions, but let me simply say that I urge you to pass the provisions in the HEROES Act that support families, children, and work. But let me specifically talk about the need for the proposed expansion of the child tax credit. As a society, we have yet to fully grapple with the harm that has occurred to our children from this pandemic. As a mother, I can tell you that the disruption is setting back both hard knowledge and social emotional learning. While the parents of privileged children have access to substantial resources to support their children's development, children from less privileged families are suffering from the loss of normal play and socialization, from the loss of formal education, lower household incomes, and greater stress in their communities. How do parents work when they cannot send their children to school? How do they educate their children when they must work? How do they pay for childcare? How can they use resources to help their children thrive educationally and emotionally when they're struggling to put food on the table? Expanding resources for children in the bottom half of the income distribution is essential. The research is clear. A fully refundable child tax credit is one of the single best things the nation can do to confront child poverty. And confronting child poverty is one of the important ways you can grow the economy. Invest in children today. Failing to address the harm to American children from the pandemic will mean that the economy may never fully recover, as these children will suffer a lifetime of loss that is to them, and their loss is our loss. There are two important long-run risks that you must confront. The first is what I just mentioned, the risk to our children and their development. The second is a growing group of displaced workers. Labor force participation, which fell to its low last seen in the early 70s, has only recovered to a low last seen in the mid-1970s. Furthermore, we're seeing ongoing permanent job loss. We're seeing ongoing long-term unemployment. Many of the tax credits in the HEROES Act enjoy uniform bipartisan support for the simple reason that they work. During a lifetime of rising debt, the effectiveness of a policy, during a time of rising debt, the effectiveness of policy must be considered, and expanding policies that support work, families, and children have the potential to reap returns to taxpayers in the long run that offset their costs. I urge you to take action today. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Stevenson. I'll now recognize Mr. Morial for your statement.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the committee. My name is Mark Morial. I'm proud to serve as President and CEO of the National Urban League. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit, historic civil rights organization dedicated to the economic empowerment of African Americans and other underserved urban populations. We conduct our work through a network of 90 affiliates across 36 states and the District of Columbia and our Washington Bureau. We are a leading housing counseling agency approved by the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development. We operate housing programs in more than 30 of our Urban League affiliates, and since 2008, we've serviced over 300,000 clients. So we bring to this conversation real on-the-ground experience working with men, women, and families who are facing the crisis of COVID head-on. In its Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Matthew Desmond quotes a woman he calls Arlene, and she describes the profound exhaustion of trying to keep a roof over her children's head. She says, "My soul is messed up." And her children are so defined by the experience of being constantly being evicted that one of them vows to become a carpenter so he can build her a house. The moratorium on evictions that was imposed by the Federal CARES Act in March expired in July. As we participate in today's hearing, some 40 million Americans, equivalent to the entire population of the state of California, are on the brink of eviction. There are more than 13.6 million Americans out of work, more than any other point since the Great Depression. And although the labor market does appear to be climbing out of a deep hole, Black and Latino workers are experiencing disproportionate economic challenges. 13% unemployment for Black workers, 10% for Latino workers, compared to a white unemployment rate of 7.3%. No matter how you cut it, the unemployment rate is far higher for all population groups than it was earlier this year. Not only that, Black and Latino workers are more likely to be employed in low-wage jobs, which are far less likely to offer remote work options, paid leave, and health insurance benefits. Low-wage workers with limited or no savings to backfill face the hardest challenges in this economy. With a nation foundering on the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression and poised to plunge even further, 43 million Americans either missed the July rent or mortgage payment and had little confidence that they could pay August on time. This is certainly worse for Black and Latino workers. The risk of loss of home ownership, especially Black home ownership, is more troubling. The Great Recession wiped out some 50 years of rising Black home ownership, with a rate now as low as it was before the Fair Housing Act passed, the period in which housing discrimination was legal. The rate across the board is as low as it's been in decades. This compounding problem of people facing eviction and facing foreclosures is something that could devastate this nation. If we look to the future, we face a future where the housing crisis of the 21st century, the housing crisis of the 2020s, could dwarf the housing crisis that went along with the Great Recession. There is work that must be done to protect Americans and to save Americans. Black and Latino households, for whom racial divides across access and home ownership rates preceded the current economic fallout, face the most severe challenges that we face. I want to talk a little bit about solutions. And I come at this as a former mayor of New Orleans, former president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, a lawyer who practiced law in construction and housing, as well as the current president of the National Urban League. Congress has to address the eviction crisis and the foreclosure crisis, with tens of millions of people facing the loss of their homes from unemployment, underemployment, lack of liquidity, and a recession. So we call on the Congress and the United States Senate particularly to pass and the president to sign the provisions of the HEROES Act. We need a bold, we need a robust provision, a robust act. That act, the HEROES Act, contains $100 million in emergency rental assistance. So as I close, we also call for the expansion across the board of all of the tax credits included in the HEROES Act to put working men and women first. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayor. Mr. Colicchio, you may proceed. You have to unmute, Tom.
Thank you, Chairman Thompson and Ranking Member Smith, for inviting me to speak today. So you may know me as a chef and a restaurateur, or as head judge on Top Chef. But I'm also a father to 3 boys and a citizen who cares deeply about this nation's eaters, a category we all fall into, whether Republican or Democrat, red state or blue. I also served as the executive producer on A Place at the Table, a documentary film directed by my wife, the filmmaker Laurie Silverbush, which opened my eyes to some inconvenient truths about hunger in the United States. I learned that hunger in this country is a widespread and man-made problem, and that we have more than enough food to feed everyone in the United States to eat healthily and well, but that our leaders have failed to undertake the policies that would make that possible. And once I learned these truths, it became my mission to try to change them, and that is in the capacity that I sit here today. So in order to respond to the pandemic effectively, it's critically important to understand exactly where the nation was beforehand. Before COVID-19, while some in the current administration were trumpeting about our great economy, the United States had 37 million people struggling with hunger. That's 37 million people. Before COVID-19, 13 million children routinely went without sufficient healthy calories to power them through a day of learning or growing, despite data showing that poor nutrition during a child's earliest years can lead to irreversible deficits and illness through her lifespan. Before COVID-19, 38 million Americans relied upon the Supplementary Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, to feed their families. The average SNAP benefit amounts to a meager $1.34 per meal. And before COVID-19, our nation shamefully and uniquely among wealthy first world economies allowed states to erect punitive bureaucratic roadblocks to receiving food assistance, even fingerprinting, as if to add a layer of deliberate difficulty and shame to the process. Even prior to COVID-19, it was not uncommon to see hungry Americans lining up at a 24-hour convenience store at 11:59 p.m. on the last day of the month with their babies and children in tow, waiting for midnight with their EBT cards that would be replenished so they could buy something to give their children for breakfast the next morning. Now, some may witness and think, what kind of parent brings their toddler to a 7-Eleven at midnight? And I ask you, what kind of parent sleeps well at night knowing that another parent anywhere must resort to that? What kind of leaders vote year after year to keep food assistance at such low numbers that any child must suffer hunger pangs and a lifelong medical and psychological consequences? And for decades, we have foisted this problem onto food banks and charities. but we're unable to meet the massive need even before COVID. Fixing hunger in this country with charity food is like putting out a raging forest fire with a couple of hook and ladders and a bucket brigade. What was actually needed was food and wage policies that would have enabled families to afford the cost of healthy food and to adequately fund it and adequately funded safety net for those times when people need a helping hand. But our leaders have other priorities, clearly, which is why children have continued to go hungry in increasing numbers, even as our stock market has soared. Since the pandemic has hit, close to 14 million people were unemployed almost overnight. We now have millions more newly poor and hungry. According to Hunger Free America, overall hunger has doubled during the pandemic, with Black, Latino, and Indigenous and immigrant families hit the hardest. The Food Research Action Center reports that 20% of all households with children, 1 in 5, are now facing hunger. And a full 40% of Americans report cutting back or skipping their own meals to feed their children. Millions of seniors have lost access to the meals they received at senior centers and can't afford to stockpile the groceries they need to stay home and safe. And today it is common to see images of cars in mile-long lines snaking along our freeways for hours to pick up charity food. The Salvation Army reports that drive-through pantries have seen an 84% increase since May. That's right, 84%. What that tells us in the United States is that you can go from being someone who helps out a food pantry to someone who needs one in a matter of weeks. You know, recently I saw Senator John Cornyn of Texas. He visited a food bank and tweeted out for a call for donations, saying that Texas food banks need our help. And it's admirable that the senator would actually go and spend time at a food bank. But let's get this straight. In the midst of a historic hunger crisis, Senator Cornyn, who along with Senator Mitch McConnell, has failed to pass the HEROES Act, a bill passed by the House of Representatives back in May that would have meaningfully addressed hunger at the federal level. Now he's calling upon everyday Americans to make up for the Senate's inaction. Well, Senator Cornyn, it's not the food banks that need help. It's the people they serve that do. And helping the people of this country is your job. It's actually Congress's job. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has also disparaged the HEROES Act as a blue state bailout. I see my time is running out. So, ladies and gentlemen of the subcommittee, let's start putting our money where our mouth is. We can actually fix this problem. One point I want to make is that our colleague, your colleague, anti-hunger advocate Jim McGovern, has said that making sure people have enough to eat and food to survive if it isn't a priority for Congress, then what is? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Colicchio. Thank you. Ms. Long, you may proceed.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Good afternoon, Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the committee. My name is Nikita Long, and I reside in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Winston-Salem is one of the richest cities in the country. It has its share of poverty, low-income jobs, crime, as do any city. Before the pandemic, I was contracted for an automotive sensor parts manufacturer through a temporary agency. Wages were not bad, and the hours worked for the needs of my family. I worked there nearly 2 years, waiting to get hired. But there was always a reason why the company had to halt hiring full-time employees. I waited and I worked, and I had no savings. My credit was in a downward spiral, and my dreams of buying a big house would have to wait. I had never worked a job making over $30,000 a year, and I have a master's degree. I do not have a criminal record, and still I face many obstacles. I have spent my life trying to break down systematically oppressive walls for myself and for so many others facing similar barriers. Manufacturing jobs were easy to get, quick hiring process, and an overload of overtime offset the low wages. I worked night shifts and weekend shifts because I had a family. And, everybody was asleep, so that was good hours for me. I came home, got the kids ready for school, and I headed off to college classes. When I saw an opportunity for a job with better wages, I jumped on it. But the trade-off was heavy metal jobs, steel-toe boots, and long hours. Like millions of Americans, COVID-19 yielded a heavy financial blow to my family. The initial response to COVID-19 was chaotic, divisive, and forced so many families to take on challenges most were not financially, physically, or mentally prepared to handle. I was unexpectedly laid off from my temporary job in late March 2020. Devastated, I went into panic mode, survival mode, thinking of what I needed to do. What could I sell that would cut back and keep my family afloat? Like millions of families, I anxiously waited to see if there would be any financial relief coming for people who had lost their jobs. A lifeline, the CARES Act, allowed me to apply and receive unemployment compensations to North Carolina, and I was approved for the federal unemployment boost. This was a lifesaver in an ocean of uncertainty. With this additional financial help, I received $823 weekly. I could keep my family safe, and now we could comply with federal and state stay-at-home mandates. I could afford my rent, my car payment, my utilities, and a cable bill. I was just offered a job at Amazon, and I'm happy. You know, I'm employed where many are not, but I'm still concerned about overdue bills and potentially exposing myself and my family to the virus. Millions of people are still unemployed. Millions are still sleeplessly watching the clock and waiting for evictions to sweep the nation. Millions of people are living in unsafe environments because of these factors. Millions are shutting down mentally because they're worried about what the future holds for the economy. As you close out the day and discuss strategies for helping families through the tax code, and my testimony becomes a reflection in your mirror, consider my story retold over 30 million times. Those are the voices of families, of individuals living in unsafe housing conditions. I am facing eviction. My landlords offered me $500 to move out by October 1st because they need to sell the home. There is so much uncertainty for my family, and I ask that you consider me when you make your decisions.
Ms. Long, thank you for sharing your testimony with us, your situation with us, and I appreciate your courage in doing so. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Brill, you are recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Alex Brill, and I'm a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today on this important tax topic. As others have noted, the coronavirus pandemic and the associated economic recession have been severe. The unemployment rate spiked more than 11 percentage points from a historic low of 3.5% in February to 14.7% in April, and was 8.4% in August. The economy contracted rapidly in the second quarter, and while a rebound is underway, the full recovery will take time. In March, as others have described, Congress enacted the CARES Act, which, along with other measures before and since then, have provided large-scale relief and assistance to both families and to businesses. Congress has also considered additional policy measures, including further tax relief, to mitigate the economic consequences of the pandemic. Today, I'd like to emphasize that further action is appropriate, but we also need to ensure that any additional policies are well-targeted, well-designed, and efficient. In my written testimony, I recommend 5 specific tax policies that would help unemployed workers return to work, improve the safety of the workplace, and facilitate the continuity of health benefits for laid-off workers. 3 of these policies are already included in the House-passed HEROES Act, the ERTC, expanding the Employee Retention Tax Credit, the expansion to the Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit, and the premium assistance to cover the costs associated with COBRA premiums. The other policies that I recommend in my written testimony include enacting the Healthy Workplace Tax Credit and a temporary expansion of the Work Opportunity Tax Credit. The written testimony describes these policies in more detail and suggests modifications to better target them. In the interest of time, I'll just discuss here the Employee Retention Tax Credit and the Healthy Workplace Tax Credit. The ERTC was established in the CARES Act to encourage businesses to retain workers through the pandemic. The current ERTC, which is available to qualified businesses for the remainder of the year, is a refundable tax credit of up to $5,000 per worker in eligible firms. Many other developed countries have adopted similar policies with great success. By subsidizing on a temporary basis the cost of keeping workers on payroll during the pandemic, a well-functioning ERTC has the potential to significantly assist the U.S. labor market. I recommend expanding the ERTC to more businesses, but not expanding the definition of qualified workers beyond the CARES Act. I recommend a September 1st effective date for the expanded policy and increasing the wage cap. These modifications will reduce the overall cost and increase the policy's efficiency and effectiveness. the Healthy Workplace Tax Credit introduced by Congressman Tom Rice, a 50% credit that's refundable against payroll taxes, is intended to encourage businesses to provide testing, reconfigure workspaces, acquire PPE, and take other safety measures. The credit would encourage wider adoption of public health and safety measures and reduce the risk of transmission of the coronavirus in the workplace. In my written testimony, I also addressed several provisions that should not be enacted, namely a second round of rebate payments, the elimination of the cap on state and local deductions, and the expanded child tax credit. The proposal to eliminate the cap on state and local deduction is one of the costliest provisions in the HEROES Act and not targeted towards taxpayers directly affected by the pandemic and the recession. On a permanent basis, this policy would cost more than $600 billion in the budget window. In closing, I would like to commend the committee for swift action in March, emphasize there is an urgency in enacting additional legislation, and encourage you to enact only those provisions that are targeted and for which there is consensus and sound rationale. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brill. Without objections, each member will be recognized for 5 minutes to question our witnesses. We will not observe the Gibbons rule in this remote setting and will instead go in order of seniority, switching between majority and minority members. Members are reminded to unmute yourselves when you are recognized for your 5 minutes. And I'll begin by recognizing myself. Ms. Long, I admire your courage and your conviction in sharing your personal experience. You've given a voice to millions of Americans who've lost their jobs and are facing hardship through no fault of their own as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. It's clear the last few months have been hard for you and your family, and you'll still face challenges in the future, even with your new job. I keep hearing similar stories from my own constituents. Over the past few months, they've found themselves in a financial hole trying to keep up with expenses and don't know how or when they'll recover. Is that your experience? And if so, would the $1,200 per family member help you alleviate these burdens?
Thank you. Yes, that is my experience. The last few months have been very challenging. You know, before the pandemic, I was working, I was paying my bills. And then the CARES Act was passed, and I was able to continue paying my bills, and I was able to continue taking care of my family. Right now, I am looking at losing my home. I'm looking at myself and my children being homeless. And, you know, I have all the things that, you know, you're told that you should have. I have a master's degree. I don't have a criminal record. And I'm fighting to figure out what am I going to do, you know, now, even with the new job. So I'm going into a new job and I have no home. I don't have any money saved up for a deposit. I don't have any money saved up for a first month's rent. My lease doesn't expire until May. I thought I had some type of security there, and here I am trying to figure out survival. You know, right now, the $1,200 would be beneficial. No, it's not the answer, but it is a lifeline to those of us who don't have an answer and that we've lost so much through no fault of our own. You know, I am the consequence of congressional inaction. There needs to be something done.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Dr. Stevenson, we've heard a lot in the media over how to characterize the economic recovery, whether it's a V or a K or a check mark. Families don't have any clarity about what to expect from the recovery in the coming months. Most of the aid in the CARES Act has expired, and the jobs report indicates that hiring is slowing down, not picking up. Is this recovery strong enough to pick these families up and set them back on their feet in time to avoid a disaster? If not, how could an additional round of economic impact payments help those families? And without this help, what will be the long-term impact on the most economically vulnerable in our country in terms of their ability to save and their debt burdens?
Well, the first round of payments showed very clearly how much help that they generate. Our economy is not strong enough to help these families on their own. We're at this point now where we need to start creating new jobs. We need new businesses to open, and yet we don't have the pandemic under control. So I don't see a wave of new businesses opening anytime soon, which is why we're seeing that job creation starting to slow. If we're able to sort of help families continue to spend with the resources that they need to support themselves and their children, that will continue to support the economy. So I do think another round of stimulus checks are needed and would help move us more quickly back to the kind of economy we had prior to the pandemic.
Thank you. Mayor Morial, the Center for Disease Control issued an eviction moratorium that some people are able to take advantage of, but it doesn't affect the amount of rent that's due. It just postpones the due date. And I'm concerned about what happens when that due date comes. In the short term, for our nation's most economically vulnerable, do you think that the cash infusion delivered through EIPs could help at least partially ease the rent crisis?
There's no doubt that it could. I think that what CDC has done is a stopgap, incomplete measure. We need a broad congressional moratorium on evictions, foreclosures, and utility shutoffs in order to protect people in the coming difficult months of the fall, indeed of the winter. So the provisions of the HEROES Act would no doubt create some support, some relief, some way to protect American citizens in communities across the nation. And I would add that doing what has been proposed in the HEROES Act, the price of that is less than the cost of homelessness and people on the streets of America and shelters overrun with people and nowhere for people to go. These things have to be analyzed in terms of what is the impact of doing nothing, sitting and waiting and watching and letting the crisis of homelessness exacerbate in this country. The second thing I want to just add, because I think it's so crucial, Amtrak is about to lay off 2,000 employees. Many airlines and retailers who held on are going to do another round of layoffs. Snub your nose at the cities and the states if you might, and you'll see millions of layoffs in local governments. How will you bring an economy back without business permitting offices, without police officers and firefighters and building inspectors? The HEROES Act provisions that support state and local government are essential. You can't bail out the airlines with a $500 million credit facility at the Federal Reserve Bank and snub your nose at cities and states and public employees and public workers. So there's an equity here. There's a fairness here. There's also the ability of leaders to see the future. The future is not a recovery. The future is more layoffs if nothing is done.
Thank you very much. Mr. Colicchio, in good times, we have kids going to bed without supper. We have hunger problems during the best of times. And the expanded EIPs that are in the HEROES Act would provide $1,200 per family member, and that begins to phase out at $75,000. But that is the quickest way to put money in the pockets of consumers. What do you think about the role a cash infusion from the EIPs can play in alleviating hunger for American families? I have to unmute, Tom.
That would go a long way to help alleviate the pain that families are feeling right now. I mean, keep in mind that right now food prices have gone up by about 16%. And so the dollars that people who are struggling have to spend, they're not going as far as they used to. So everything helps. Every little bit helps. I mean, people are really struggling. And, and people who 6 months ago, who were solidly middle class, who never thought that they would have to wait online for food, they're finding themselves right there, right at this moment. I mean, right now, again, SNAP, there's a year lag between sort of getting our hands around the numbers. The estimate's that there are 50 million Americans right now who have applied for SNAP or are currently receiving SNAP, and it's totally inadequate. It usually doesn't get through 3/4 of the month. The $1,200 is a lifeline to people who are struggling to feed their children, to feed their. I mean, think about again, solidly middle class person who lost their job, who are the psychological effects that they have to not be able to feed their children. $1,200 will go a long way to help.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to recognize Mr. Rice for 5 minutes. Mr. Smith has asked to go last in the questioning. So, Mr. Rice, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Great, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you holding this hearing. I think we have it backwards, though. We didn't have a single hearing on the HEROES Act, and perhaps if we had had one, we could have worked through some of these issues and be a lot farther down the path toward helping the American people rather than just Ms. Pelosi and her leadership drafting the bill so that we had no input and no regular order. I agree with all of the witnesses, really, that we need to provide more assistance to families and children and people in need, particularly. I also am really concerned about getting businesses reopened. The Healthy Workplaces tax credit that I drafted that was adopted in the Senate bill would provide tax credits for businesses to make their locations safe. We can't expect workers to go back to work if they feel they are not being treated in a reasonably safe manner. So I think that would be something that would be terribly important to be included. But, you know, the bottom line here is that the HEROES Act contains a mass of superfluous material that has nothing to do with the COVID crisis, and that until now, our leadership on both sides negotiating this, we haven't had any hearings on it at the level where it should be in our committee, as we're having a first hearing on it right now, are at loggerheads over whether or not the Republicans are going to succumb to the Democrats' demands of things like repealing the cap on the SALT deduction, of which 50% of that money goes to the top percent, 1% of wage earners, and 90% of that money goes to the top 10% of wage earners, which makes absolutely no sense. Cost almost $1 trillion, and why that would ever be included in a bill like this is beyond me. And it's simply ransom that folks are requiring so that we can get help to the very folks that need it. So I am very, very disappointed in this process. I know my constituents are horribly disappointed in this process. This is so important, in my opinion, that this hearing should not be today. It should have been 3 months ago, and it should be live so that we can actually talk to these people in more detail and get more of their very valuable input, because this is horribly important to American families. And we have been derelict in our duty that we haven't had this meeting already, and that we haven't worked through these problems. And the fact that the SALT cap, the elimination of the SALT cap would be even a part of this is just terrible. That would be thrown in and used as ransom to get relief to people who terribly need it. The relief to states portion, over $500 billion. The problem with that, in my opinion, is that we've already sent $150 billion to states, most of which has not even been used yet. South Carolina got $1.9 billion. Most of that money has not even been used. That's a significant part of their state budget. So, the fact that we would use this as a mechanism to bail out states who haven't been fiscally responsible at the expense of states that have is again, something that to me is very, very troubling. It angers me that we would use this crisis and the pain of these people who need this help as a mechanism to force a bailout of states. So no, I totally agree with every one of the witnesses that we need more help for people on the lower end of the income scale. We need to make sure that child care is provided for. We need to make sure that that people are fed. We don't want Americans starving. That is just an anathema to me. We don't want people waiting in line at midnight at a convenience store for their EBT card. I totally agree with that. But the fact that we're using their pain, that folks are using their pain to require that we give tax deductions to millionaires and billionaires by doing away with the cap on the SALT deduction, that we're using their pain to force bailout of the states that have been fiscally irresponsible is just horrifying to me. And
thank you very much. Your time has expired. I recognize Mr. Doggett for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for organizing this hearing. And to all of our witnesses, what really powerful testimony we've heard. I hope some of the people over in the Senate are listening to this. We've now had 4 long months since we acted with legislation in the House. And yes, I agree with my Republican colleagues that legislation was rushed. It was rushed because many people felt that we had an emergency, that folks were out there in long unemployment lines, in long lines at our food banks because they were hungry and because our businesses were shut down, many to never open again, and that we could not wait to act. And in those 4 long months, rent has come due, mortgage payments, pickup truck payments, the credit card bills, people struggling, wondering, how will we survive this? Will we be put out on the street hungry? And how have our Republican colleagues responded to that? Well, the Senate Majority Leader said the state and local governments could just go bankrupt. And for 2 long months, in fact, indeed, until the last emergency unemployment assistance check had been sent out, they did nothing. They said it really wasn't that big a problem. It was a little like President Trump's comments when he knew otherwise, as he has admitted recently, when he knew otherwise, saying, oh, it'll just go away, this virus, when the summer comes. It'll be like a miracle. It'll disappear. Well, apparently that was their attitude about the crisis that Americans were facing in May. So in May and June and July, they did absolutely nothing. And then finally, they came up with a proposal that many of the Senate Republicans wouldn't agree to that was somewhere around $1 trillion. When they did not negotiate in good faith on that, the president said he'll just do it all with the stroke of a pen. And so let's look what has happened in my state as a result of that stroke of the pen. He raided hurricane relief funds at the very time we were having hurricane season to use that to provide half of the emergency unemployment assistance that Texans had been receiving. And now, just like the hurricane blowing through the state, it's blown out and there's no more relief coming and nothing in sight for our unemployed Texans. The consequences of inaction are far-reaching, as our witnesses have described. Now, I'm interested in the fact that my colleague has just told us about the disadvantages of the SALT repeal. I actually personally happen to agree with him, and I voted against it myself. But I'm amazed at his silence on a provision that Republicans put into this bill to provide what are called net operating expense losses to 43 taxpayers, each of whom earned more than $1 million a year. And those folks ended up getting, under the Republican amendment to the bill, $1.6 million on average each. That provision is still there, and it needs to be removed, and it is removed under the version of the legislation we passed on May 15th. We don't believe that it's right to give more to people that earn more than $1 million a year, $1.6 million in relief, more than was given to all of the hospitals in America under that bill. And it seems to me that if there is good faith, there would be good faith negotiation about these matters. Instead, what we have had is a bill that was voted on this week that actually goes down instead of going toward the middle. Let me just ask Dr. Stevenson, not all economic stimulus measures are created equally. Can you tell us why things like lost carryback rank at the bottom and assistance like emergency and unemployment assistance rank near the top in stimulating the economy, Dr. Stevenson?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. And I have to tell you that it was exactly what I was thinking as I listened to your colleague discuss the need for the support to be really targeted. And I agree with that. So things like net operating loss, that's not very targeted. And if we think about what's needed is we need the people who've lost incomes to be able to go out and spend that income so we can stop the bleeding. Now, if Nikita can't pay her bills, if she is evicted and she's not paying rent, that hurts not her and her family, but it also hurts the people in her community that would normally receive her money. Right? That hurts the people you pay rent to, it hurts the stores you buy your groceries from, and then they suffer, and that's the spiral goes on. And so when we talk about bang for our buck in terms of supporting the economy, we need the money to get into the hands of people who are going to spend it immediately. And lower income families will be the ones to spend that money. And that's why we see that as having the highest multiplier, and why economists talk about that as being the most important kind of spending for supporting the macroeconomy.
Thank you, Dr. Stevenson.
Thank you.
Time has expired. Mr. Schweikert, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Are you there? Mr. LaHood, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Arrington, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Ferguson, are you there? You're recognized for 5 minutes. Maybe we'll go back to the Democratic side and take questions from Mr. Larson from Connecticut. Mr. Larson, are you with us? Ms. Sanchez, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Unmute. You're not unmuted. We can't hear you, Linda. Now we're not able to hear you. While you're working out that technical glitch, we'll go back to Mr. Schweikert, who's rejoined the committee. Mr. Schweikert, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
And forgive me, it's the chaos when we're doing these from our home offices and we have a 5-year-old at home. There are a couple questions I'd like to ask. Ms. Stevenson, in your testimony, you actually touched on one thing that I'm not sure we've talked about or walked through what it truly means. We've been in the Joint Economic Committee, have been looking at the line of those going back into work. And there's a fear that daycare, schools being open, creates sort of a barrier for the next wave of workers to be able to accept positions because of all of us who have little people, our obligations to be home taking care of kids. What do you see is the necessity to find a way to open up schools, daycare safely? But what would that mean in our ability to get the vitality, what's the proper term, velocity moving again? What are you seeing?
So, I think that we just have not had quite enough job creation for that lack of childcare to be really holding the economy back. That doesn't mean it's not a problem. And particularly it's a problem for the families where they can't go back to work because they've got to take care of their kids. So they have an income problem. But if there's somebody else there to take a job and there's not enough jobs for everybody, it's not exactly holding the economy back yet. It will start to hold the economy back for sure. And I'll tell you, the thing I've been most concerned about is that very few communities have prioritized providing childcare for the parents who absolutely do need it to go back to school. We have focused too much on getting all schools open, providing childcare for all, schools for all, when what we should be doing is prioritizing the parents who need it to be able to work, because we can do that faster. So I would say that if we want this progression in the fall to continue, we do need to find ways to get people safely back in school. And I want to add something that Mark Morial already mentioned, which is we have problems with state and local government budgets. We're going to see layoffs of teachers. That's going to make that hard to do. Right as that's starting to bite on the economy, the parents are going to not be able to get the kids back in school.
So I wanted to focus a bit just on understanding, the curve, and then we come back with what our solutions are. Mr. Brill. In that same sort of context, those of us in Arizona, if you actually look at our economic expansion numbers, we actually appear to be doing pretty well right now. Do you have a sense of what's going on regionally, and what of that is federal policies, and what is it state and local policies that are creating either some success of expansion or causing some difficulties?
Sure. Thank you for the question. There certainly is very regional variation, both in the severity of the consequences of the coronavirus from an economic perspective, as well as obviously from a public health perspective, as well as variation with respect to the recovery. Many of the states in the Northeast that have been hit earliest and hardest have more shutdown orders in place today and higher unemployment rates compared to some of the other states, particularly some of the Western, but not most Western states in the Union. And there is considerable variation. We're seeing pain across the country, no question, but the degree to which that pain is being felt has tended to vary, mostly with the severity of the pandemic.
Time has expired. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We'll go now to Ms. Moore. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Thompson.
Oh, is Ms. Sanchez back online? Okay. Excuse me. We'll go back in order.
Can you hear me?
We can. You're recognized for 5 minutes, Ms. Sanchez.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to our panel of witnesses for joining us today, especially Ms. Long. Your experience is exactly what I have been hearing from my constituents in Southern California. And as a mom, my heart breaks listening to what your family has been through and what you're experiencing currently. As most of our panelists have said, never have the consequences of inaction been so grave. Families are losing their homes, parents are desperate for childcare, and countless people are looking for work with no success, all while the Senate took months to act on a watered-down bill. I have to say that I've been proud to champion several pandemic-related tax bills that were included in the HEROES Act. The House passed that bill in May, and the Senate sat around and did nothing until this week, as if hunger and homelessness and joblessness, takes a pause. It doesn't. It has continued. The HEROES Act worked to balance many competing but compelling interests during this very uncertain and certainly unprecedented time. Small businesses and individuals alike are trying to regain their footing while we're still in the middle of a pandemic. The pandemic has not gone away. My top priority all along has been to give a helping hand to workers and working families in my district. People don't want a handout. They want to be treated fairly by their government, and they want dignity, as Mr. Colicchio said. They don't want to have to stand in miles-long food lines for assistance. And I'm proud that what our committee authored does exactly that. It provides that dignity. I'm particularly proud of my bill to give employers a credit for covering pandemic-related expenses like childcare, temporary housing, or even uniform cleaning for their employees, and that was included in the HEROES Act. expenses like that are pushing families to their breaking point, and I'm trying to help ease that burden in any way that I can. Dr. Stevenson, could you share your thoughts on the impact that the tax provisions in the HEROES Act would have specifically on communities of color, and specific to communities of color, single-parent households who I think bear the largest burdens during this pandemic?
Yeah, absolutely. And Alex Brill already mentioned that we're seeing a lot of variation across the country in who's getting hit the hardest. And what we see is that communities of color have gotten hit the hardest, both in terms of suffering from the pandemic itself, from healthcare problems, but also from income loss. As you mentioned, single parents, there's no one to stay home while they go to work. So they are struggling with the school closures absolutely the most. So the kinds of tax provisions that are in the HEROES Act are incredibly important for doing two things. One, getting incomes into those lower income households. That's why the expansion and full refundability of the child tax credit is so important. That's why payments like the idea of direct payments, $1,200 checks to families is so important. We want to provide a floor for those families so that they're able to meet the very basic expenditures. It's not going to solve everything, but it helps. And then you can layer on the many provisions that Alex Brill mentioned that will help boost employment, because we do need to make sure that we can transition these communities back to full employment as quickly as possible. We're already seeing long-term permanent scarring set in, and I really do urge you to take fast action to reduce the amount of permanent labor market scarring that occurs in communities of color, because as a nation, we'll be paying the price for that for decades to come.
Great. Thank you so much. Mr. Morial, thank you for sharing your thoughts with us today. I want you to put on your formal local government hat, and can you talk to us a bit more about how this committee can best assist our cities and communities as they battle this crisis on many fronts? And I also, before you answer that, want to just say it's ironic that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are complaining about lifting of the SALT cap when they gave permanent tax cuts to the top 1% of income earners in this country with the TCJA in 2017. And I also want to refute the notion that the assistance for state and local governments in the HEROES Act only goes to blue states, because I just checked, and the second highest unemployment rate in April was in Kokomo, Indiana, which is not a blue state by any means. And I don't think that any of these provisions that we're talking about today only go to certain states. They go to everybody who's suffering. And with that, Mr. Morial, I'll let you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Congresswoman.
The gentlewoman's time has expired, so we can ask you to maybe submit that answer in writing, if you would, Mayor. Thank you.
Yes, if you would, for the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Okay. Right. Thank you.
Now I'm going to recognize Mr. Arrington for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and panelists. An important discussion. Nothing more important right now than getting our country back, getting our children to school, getting our families, back on their feet and into the marketplace, lights on for our employers. And, I agree with so much of what's been said, Mr. Chairman, already. I think the Senate has acted in a protracted way and not in a timely way. So I'll agree with Ms. Sanchez. But I will also say that my colleagues on the Democrat side have put a completely partisan bill, the HEROES Act, which was going nowhere. I mean, here we are in a major, unprecedented national emergency, and we're not sitting down to have the conversations. And I'm willing to consider everything that has been put on the table. I mean, I think we all understand that right now we've got to get assistance to where the needs are, and we need to start with the people who have been hit the hardest. But we also need to provide liquidity, whether it's PPP or those businesses that have been hit so hard that they operate at a loss, they're not making a profit. What does that mean? That means they can't meet payroll. It means that more working families associated with those businesses. Businesses aren't evil. They are creating value, and they also create jobs and livelihoods for people. And so I just believe we should just assume, at least at this subcommittee, that we're all trying to find a good path forward. But the HEROES Act was talking about financing cannabis. It was talking about the humanities and arts and election policies and bailouts for pension, union multi-employer pensions, all of which may need to be addressed in the right context and at the right time. But my goodness, I'm disappointed on all ends of this, and so I'll let that be my comment about the process and how pathetic it is that we would go home and on recess without having met the needs of our fellow Americans who are hurting, many of them. Now, we do have hundreds of billions of dollars in play that hasn't been spent. It's been distributed. It's been appropriated. 75% of that city and state money has been hoarded by states and not distributed. 99% of the monies for schools have not been spent. So, I mean, I'm not ready to just throw more money at this without knowing where the gaps are after the money meets the people who have the needs and where we intended it to go. And I'm sure most people agree with that. Mr. Brill, when I think about the moral hazard of putting more money out there in it to bail out cities or states that have a history of mismanaging their fiscal affairs, or multi-employer pensions, which are upside down and need to be addressed, but without fixing the underlying problem and giving them a way to just keep things locked down, seems like it's a really big national moral hazard issue that we ought to just, at a minimum, consider in our discussions about what the next COVID legislation is. Mr. Brill, can you just speak to that concern, please?
Sure. Thank you, Congressman. As you described, there are a number of existing challenges, fiscal policy and economic policy that predated the coronavirus. The funding issues related to multi-employer plans is one of those challenges that Congress has struggled with finding solutions to in the past and continues to be a concerning issue for those plans that are underfunded and in some cases severely so. But as you're suggesting, I am in full agreement. That is not the immediate challenge related to the pandemic and the associated economic recession. And so those issues are important and are worthy of consideration and evaluation as they have been in the past. Most appropriate right now would be to take timely actions that are targeted and well designed, as I've described, as Professor Stevenson has described, and other provisions that may exist as well.
Mr. Chairman, how much time do I have remaining, sir?
Your time has expired.
Okay. Thank you for the hearing. Thank you for the time.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to go to a 2-to-1 ratio on our witnesses. We'll hear from Ms. Moore and Mr. Boyle, and then we'll go back to minority members for questions. Ms. Moore, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr.
You have to unmute.
I did unmute. Can you hear me? Thank you so much for this hearing, Mr. Chairman, and thank all my colleagues for joining. I guess my first question I'd like to give to Dr. Betsy Stevenson from the University of Michigan. I apologize, I missed the first part of your testimony, so I apologize if you've already answered this. Was there any sense, while Mr. Brill said that the economy is recovering, is there any sense that even under the best case scenario, how long this deep recession will last?
Yes, so what I really want to emphasize is that what we did early on, the growth we've seen so far is the easy part.
Wait one moment. Can other members mute while the witness is giving her answer?
Okay. Oh, I see. Because yeah, thank you. So I do think that we're halfway there. It means we have the other half to go, but the other half is the hard half. And the reason it's the hard half is these are not likely to be workers who are called back to their easy jobs. So if you want a timeline, I think with no action by Congress, that we really see this recession going on for more than a year. If you think about it, if we continued at the pace of job growth that we had in August, it would take us 8 months. And I don't think we're going to have the pace of job growth we had in August for coming months. So I would say a best case scenario is a year, and it could go on for longer.
Unmute, Gwen.
Thank you. That's what I wanted to hear, because that sort of comports with what we've heard from other economists. And so given that, I think when we passed the bill in May, and we asked Mr. Morial for $100 billion in foreclosure relief, and state and local governments who, by the way, in my state, it's kind of a purple state, but we have spent all trying to save our population from COVID, and we need to reimburse things. I hear my colleagues saying we need to open up schools, and not one 2x4 of plexiglass has been put up. Not one ventilation system has been replaced in the school districts around. And so I don't know how we do that without money. And so given your testimony, Dr. Stevenson, that you're anticipating seeing this going on for a year perhaps, I am just, I'm just questioning why we haven't seen at least some kind of decent counter proposal. I guess that leads me into my next question about moral hazard. And maybe I'll start with the Republican witness, Mr. Brill. I'm sorry. Do you agree with some of our colleagues that there's sort of a moral hazard, given that we're going to see this, for a year? Any moral hazard in providing people with the unemployment compensation or economic impact payments? I know your testimony says that we ought to do some other sort of tax deferrals for businesses, but do you see any moral hazard in us helping individuals?
Without any doubt, there are, as many have testified already today, millions of individuals who are suffering significantly from this downturn, from the loss of jobs and the loss of income. I don't disagree with any of those statements that have been made. My concern is about some of the degree to which these policies are targeted, or therefore are actually not well targeted. So, for example, the economic impact.
This is my time. I need to move on because I want to ask Mr. Morial some questions about the $100 billion in foreclosure relief. As you've indicated, I don't know if you indicated it, that this relief was only toward those folks who lived in government housing. And so many of the landlords are, 2-3 family houses, duplexes. They can't really afford. They're not the bad guys that are just throwing people on the street. But you're estimating that the top 10 cities that are going to see evictions have a 30% or more African-American population. What is it going to look like when a lot of people who look like you, Nikita, are going to be on the street? What you said that it's going to cost more for us to do that than it would cost for us to help them. And I want to just give you a few seconds to elaborate on that point.
Let me tell you, the moral outrage is that we would watch people become homeless and do nothing. The moral outrage is that we would allow the loss of billions of dollars of wealth and do nothing. The moral outrage is that we would fiddle while the country, in effect, is the economy of the country is being engulfed in a fire.
That's the gentlewoman's time has expired.
Thank you. Thank you, sir, and thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
And Mayor, we're not picking on you on the time. Members have a tendency to state their answer, and then ask you the question. So we are limited, however. Mr. Boyle, are you with us? There you are. Mr. Boyle, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I am. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening this. I was just attempting to grab off my printer there one of the comments of the many that we've received from our constituents in this age of COVID, and specifically the comment that I'm attempting to get from our constituent tracking service system, IQ. It's just how much those $1,200 a month payments mean to individuals, and some truly horrific stories. So if I can't get that in the next few minutes, I'll, with your indulgence, enter it into the record later. Let me also just thank Mark Morial for the amazing work the Urban League does. We probably have one of the most active chapters here in Philadelphia. We do a lot of work with them right now, specifically on the census, though some of that, unfortunately, some of the in-person stuff that we were doing and planning had to be paused because of COVID-19. It is also so remarkable, for all the wrong reasons, that we are here almost exactly 4 months after the HEROES Act was passed on May 15th, and no further aid. I was quite proud of the first 2 months of COVID when Congress was able to come together on a bipartisan basis and pass several rounds of important, meaningful legislation totaling almost $3 trillion. I believe one of the bills, as I recall, passed unanimously in both chambers. But since then, we've been totally stuck, even though the COVID situation hasn't gotten better at all. I wanted to pick up on one of the points that a witness made maybe an hour ago now, talking specifically about how those at the lower end of the economic, socioeconomic scale tend to actually stimulate the economy the most when they get things like a $1,200 stimulus check. I believe Ms. Stevenson spoke about that earlier, but I would like to throw it either to her or any of the witnesses to talk a little further about that it's not just getting the $1,200 to individuals who desperately need it, but also the way in which that actually improves the overall economy. I'd like to make that link more explicit.
I'd be happy to jump in. Look, one of the problems we've seen is high-income households have really boosted their savings. And when you're saving, you're not spending, and that's part of what's caused the economy to contract. So handing money to high-income households is not going to solve our problem. When we give it to lower-income households, what they spend everything they get just to survive. So every dollar we give them gets back into the economy.
Great. How would you, if assuming that the current form passed in the HEROES Act, which Senate Republicans in this White House have continued to block, despite the fact the United States unquestionably has had the worst figures when it comes to dealing with COVID-19 in the world, more than 20% of the cases for only 4% of the world's population, and a corresponding high unemployment rate compared to a number of other countries also affected by COVID-19. If not the structure we chose in the HEROES Act, I'm curious how you would recommend structuring the stimulus payments, both to adults, but also to minors, since that was one of the frequent, the latter point about minors not getting the sort of assistance that they needed, those kind of in that college age who missed out. That was one of the frequent complaints I noticed in emails and phone calls that we were getting from our young adult constituents.
Sorry, you have to mute so there's not feedback. Let me say that was obvious. I mean, that was a huge oversight. You know, college students are themselves struggling, and we've never seen so many young adults living with their parents. That's the right thing for them to do, given the public health situation, but leaving them out of stimulus seems like a mistake. And let me just be frank, I think Congress ignores the needs of children just too often. And so making sure that we're directing money towards children right now, even though they're not here and banging on your door and telling you how much they're suffering. As a parent, let me tell you, I'm looking out, I'm seeing the kids, and they're all really struggling. My college students are struggling. We're seeing food insecurity among the college students. I see elementary school and high school students struggling. And I really think that if that's not your biggest priority right now to support children and their families, then I think your priorities are mistaken.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. LaHood, are you with us? Mr. Ferguson.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'm here.
You're recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all of our witnesses for joining us today. And I think we can look over the last few months at areas of the country that have begun to reopen, and what we've seen is in those areas that have begun to reopen, that we see a lot of economic benefit to that, and there are ways to do it safely and effectively. And just like we've seen here in my home state of Georgia, we have opened safely. We have done it sensibly. And what we're seeing is that we are preventing the long-term unemployment effects, and we're allowing students to go back to class in many areas. And we are seeing our state economy begin to boom here. I think, as I listen to a lot of the testimony, it's clear that more work does need to be done. There are areas of the economy that continue to hurt, and there are workers that are in fact out of work. But when you look at states that have opened in a sensible and safe way, we see drastic differences in the unemployment numbers, and we see that as people return to work and they have the dignity of work, that their lives continue to improve. We saw, as last month, as we saw the $600 a week unemployment benefit expire, we saw the unemployment rate fall to 8.4%. The number one issue that I'm hearing from businesses in my district, their number one limiting factor to growth and to growing businesses here and improving Georgia's economy is access to workers. And so I want to see what the unemployment numbers look like going the August unemployment numbers. But if you look at the state of Georgia, it looks like that our unemployment right now is going to drop to somewhere around 5.9%. That's significantly under the national average of 8.4 and under the national average of 10.2% unemployment back in July. So as you begin to see states carefully reopen, do it safely, you see a significant benefit. And I think when I look at the state of Georgia, I think that we've done a lot of things well here. And I think that we've maintained capacity in our healthcare systems. I think we have, the Georgians are doing the right thing, and we are seeing a significant benefit to that. So as we go into the third quarter, we begin to look at growth. We begin to look at the unemployment numbers. I think you're going to continue to see those improve in states like Georgia. Mr. Brill, you had started to answer a question from Ms. Moore regarding the enhanced unemployment. Could you go ahead and finish that? I was very interested in what you were going to say there.
Thank you, Congressman. I was trying to make two brief points. One with respect to the impact payments. The round of impact payments in the CARES Act, there's over 160 million payments were made. And my concern with this policy, with reestablishing this policy, is that it is not well targeted. It's not the sense that there are not people in need. There are people in need. Many people have described that at this hearing today. It's not a binary choice for Congress to either establish a $450 billion second round of economic impact payments or do nothing. The issues related to food insecurity and housing insecurity are very real and should be addressed, and they should be addressed with more targeted policies than that. With respect to unemployment insurance, the benefits that were paid, the $600 $600 per week benefits that were paid previously under the CARES Act likely had little impact on the labor market at the time. However, going forward, as the Congressional Budget Office has noted, payments that raise incomes above unemployment incomes above wage incomes will have some adverse impacts on the labor market. And it doesn't mean that we should not have that policy at all. In fact, the administration is providing additional relief beyond the normal UI program. And I think that that's appropriate, and it could be legislated. There could be a compromise between the pre-CARES Act policy and the CARES Act policy.
Thank you. So it's safe to say that we've got to have targeted relief. We have to look at the industries that really need it. We have to look at the workers that really need it. We've got to make sure that that schools have the resources they need to reopen, but things need to be targeted and not broad. With that, Mr. Chairman, my time has expired, and I will yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Ferguson. Mr. Byer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. As you know, Mr. Chairman, I'm a businessman. I've had more than 40 years of making deals every day. And it is lousy business to negotiate with yourself. We put the HEROES Act out there on May 15th, and it does most of the things that Democrats would want, $3.5 trillion. And then we got nothing from the Senate, week after week after week. So then our speaker dropped the $3.5 trillion to $2.5 trillion, took $1 trillion off. Again, nothing. Then she took another $300 billion off. And then 4 months later, finally, the Senate acts, and we get the most emaciated bill that they can't even get action on the Senate floor. This is not a case of us not being willing to negotiate. We've gone over the top to try to make sure that something can happen. And one of the huge differences is that we want money for state and local governments who've already laid off 1 million workers, and the Senate wants nothing. So, Dr. Stevenson, how can my Republican friends go home to Texas, to Arizona, to Nebraska, to South Carolina, with their fiscal communities in tatters? These communities are going to have to raise taxes. They can't like that. And will their cost to borrow be much more expensive for years to come because of their destroyed bond ratings?
Yes, so I want to be clear because this has come up a few times. I don't see any moral hazard problems with giving states and localities the money that they need. States are not able to borrow to fund current expenditures, and that's the way state constitutions work, and it's absolutely up to the federal government to fill in the holes for state and local governments so that they do not lay off the frontline community workers that help people, as has already been mentioned, get business permits, start businesses, teaching the kids, et cetera. So that money is extremely needed. As states go into a borrowing crunch, you could absolutely see problems, with their fiscal response, with their credit ratings and problems like that. But my biggest concern is the way that they are going to lay off workers. Look, think about what happened in the 2008 recession. States laid off workers, really not starting until around 2010. We didn't see state and local government employment fully recover from the 2008 recession until 2019, right before the pandemic. We can't afford to have that happen again. And you must ensure that they're able to maintain their employment levels. I really also just want to mention that it's not just unemployment you need to be looking at. You need to be looking at labor force participation because it's rock bottom. People aren't looking for jobs because there aren't jobs to look for.
Thank you, Dr. Stevenson. I want to read some letters in my 2 minutes left. This one from Alexandria, Virginia, underlines the depth of need that remains in our communities. Quote, at this point, you're probably exhausted from hearing from myself and others like me, but I can't let it go unknown what the lack of a stimulus bill is doing to me, my family, and millions of others. I, like so many other Americans, lost my job at COVID, and unfortunately, my job loss is permanent. I'm a college student who can no longer afford college courses. I'm only 11 courses away from graduating. At this point, it seems I will never reach that milestone. I can't afford food on a regular basis. I'm out of options. I don't qualify for any other assistance, and my job hunt comes back with nothing. I apply for jobs every day and not even an interview coming back. My parents live paycheck to paycheck and cannot afford to help myself or my brother anymore as they have exhausted their savings. Another constituent from Springfield writes about the importance of the economic impact payments, which Mitch McConnell excluded from his so-called skinny bill. I'm writing to encourage Congress to pass another coronavirus relief bill, which includes direct payments to American families. As coronavirus cases continue to rise, workers, including my mother, my grandparents, and me, stand to be furloughed or laid off permanently as businesses close once more to stop the spread of the virus. My mother makes $22,000 a year. My parents rely on their part-time work to supplement Social Security. My sister and I, both students, need any money we can just to stay afloat. $1,200 would be an invaluable sum to my struggling family and families across Virginia. Mr. Chairman, with 35 seconds left, every Democrat I know wants there to be a deal. And we'd love to have a meaningful discussion with our Republican friends about getting the support needed for families. I just hope that there will be a reasonable compromise in the days ahead. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Byer. Mr. Swazi, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all the witnesses. I really appreciate the time that you put in here. I want to thank the mayor. I'm a former mayor myself. We were colleagues at the time, Mayor. I was the mayor of my small city on Long Island, and I always respected the work that you did. And Ms. Long, thank you so much for your testimony. We really appreciate you taking all the time to be with us and being so candid about what you're going through. It takes a lot of guts for you to do that, and we're very grateful to you. And I'm thank you to all the witnesses. I really appreciate it very much. Mr. Brill, you said in your testimony that further action is appropriate. In fact, you said there was some urgency to it. And I appreciate that very much that you said that. And you had some very interesting proposals that you made, many of which I agree with. But do you agree with Mr. Arrington that the Senate has taken way too long, that they've been protracted, that they've delayed this process?
I would agree that in July, that it wasn't until July that we saw.
Do you agree that with Mr. Arrington that they've delayed the process?
I would agree that it was not until July that we saw proposals from the U.S. Senate.
That's a delay, right? So you proposed your 5 different things in your testimony. Do you think that that's comprehensive? Is that everything, or is that all we should do, or should we do more than that?
Those are the tax provisions that I would recommend. I would recognize that there are other policies that are not tax provisions that would be appropriate.
So there are things beyond those 5 proposals that you made that you think we should do?
Yes, there are.
So as has been pointed out, the House proposed a $3.5 trillion bill 4 months ago. Mitch McConnell said, let's do a pause. Let's see what happened. There was no action whatsoever from the other side, from the administration. There was a proposal for $1 trillion at one point. As was pointed out, Speaker Pelosi came back at $2.5 trillion, almost as low as $2 trillion at one point. And then the Senate finally came out yesterday with a $500 billion bill, which is just, it's laughable if it wasn't so sad. So I want to just address some of the comments that some of my colleagues have made over and over again about bailing out other states. And they're referring to my state. I'm from the state of New York. And I just want to remind them, as I often do, that the state of New York sends more, the people of the state of New York send more money to the federal government than they get back than any other state in the United States of America. We bail out South Carolina on a regular basis every single year. And I apologize for using the term bailout because it offends me so much when I hear that bailout comment. So we talked about the different circumstances in different states and some of the harder hit states. Well, my state was one of the early hard hit states. And I don't know if you watch television or not, but there were people on long lines in the cold at the time. It was still cold in March. And there were people coughing on each other in the rain and in the sleet, waiting to go and get tested because nobody had figured this thing out yet. And we had refrigerator trucks filled with bodies, dead bodies of people that had died because we hadn't figured out how we were going to deal with COVID yet. And you wonder why we're so careful now in our reopening and why we have such high unemployment. And we're not seeking a bailout. We're seeking compensation from our lost revenues that we have lost, not to fix our pensions, not to fix irresponsible behavior, but lost revenues that we've experienced because of this devastating impact that we've had in our state. We're looking to recoup the money that we spent to respond to the coronavirus on a regular basis. State and local aid is so essential. Mr. Brill, you would agree that laying off employees, whether they're teachers or police officers or firefighters or healthcare workers, will have a devastating impact, not only on the services, which I'm not even asking you about that, but on the economy. the state governments, the local governments that have to lay off these employees will have a devastating long-term impact on the economy. You'd agree with that, Mr. Brill?
Congressman, as Dr. Stevenson testified a moment ago, states don't have the borrowing opportunities, as you know, that the federal government has. The question in my mind is not whether or not a penny should be provided to the states, but whether or not $1 trillion should be provided to the states.
Just so you know, and so everyone else knows, and I appreciate that, Mr. Brill, and thank you for agreeing with me, and you just think the number may be too high. Nancy Pelosi, our speaker, has said publicly that she's willing to cut the money for state and local aid in half as part of her proposal to try and negotiate with our Senate colleagues to try and get something done. I want to finish up by just talking about SALT. You had it in your written testimony. Some other colleagues have talked about SALT. The SALT deduction is not a subsidy for wealthy Americans. The SALT deduction is a subsidy for states, progressive states like mine, that provide services to people. The 1%, that is often the base of many of the people on this call on the other side of the aisle, the 1% pay 50% of the taxes in my state. And some of my colleagues from South Carolina and North Carolina and Florida and Arizona are the beneficiaries of what's happening right now as we speak. People are leaving my state because of the taxes they pay here, and they no longer have the SALT deduction. They're leaving my state and going to lower tax states. And who gets left holding the bag? Low and moderate income person.
Gentleman's time has expired.
I wholeheartedly disagree.
Thank you very much. I'm so sorry you don't have a chance to disagree with me because there's no time left. But thank you.
Ms. Delbaney, are you back? Okay. Mr. Smith, we're going to go to you. There are no other on-subcommittee members left. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I will defer to be the last to ask questions on the committee.
You are the last to ask questions. There are no other on-committee members. The way that we will proceed is all of the on-subcommittee members will go, you being the last, and then we'll go to the off-subcommittee members. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
I'll defer to be the last, even off the subcommittee. Thank you.
Well, you're recognized for 5 minutes now as the last member of the subcommittee.
I guess I'm unclear that off subcommittee members will have privileges more than I will.
No, off subcommittee members will be recognized after the on subcommittee members go.
And as the remaining Republican, I request to defer and to be the last questioner.
As has been explained to you, off video and on video, the rules of the subcommittee are that the on committee members go first, and then after that, the off subcommittee members will go.
Okay. I hope that we can revisit the structure of this then. I am concerned about regular order, and we can take that up later. But Mr. Chairman, I do want to certainly reiterate what we heard earlier from Mr. Rice, that this conversation could have and should have taken place a long time ago. It is fascinating to me that there are assertions made and accusations made without regard for all of the information. And we could have had a hearing before the HEROES Act. The HEROES Act, there was no intent for that to be a bipartisan solution, realizing that any solution, given the dynamics and structure of Congress right now, any solution needs to be bipartisan. I mean, there were some things that I voted for in the past that I didn't like, but to attempt to help folks in need, we move forward in a way that I think is, there have been some good things to happen, and I think some effective policies come out of the bipartisan solutions. So when we see a jamming by the majority to jam through legislation that is not even remotely bipartisan. Financing of cannabis. I hear from local officials all the time how dangerous that is for local communities. So don't tell me we're going to help local communities with the HEROES Act and at the same time hurt them. We owe the American people better solutions than that. I do want to thank our witnesses here today, excuse me, for their participation here today. I appreciate your insights and the perspective that you bring. I would like to go down the panel with a couple of questions. It's common knowledge that the HEROES Act is not the best solution or even an achievable solution. So it's not the only thing we should be looking at. Are there items not included in HEROES which should be in the next package? And are there provisions in HEROES we should not? On, please.
I'm happy to go first. As I discussed in my testimony, I think there are both provisions to keep as well as provisions to add. And the two that are outlined in my testimony to add are both the temporary expansion of the WOTC credit as proposed by Senate Republicans, as well as Congressman Rice's healthy workplace tax credit.
Okay. Other panelists wish to?
Let me offer a comment. I'm not prepared to answer that, because I think the issue is passing the HEROES Act or negotiating an appropriate substitute. And I can provide you with a long list in writing, but what I don't want to do today is change the conversation or change the subject where we're reaching for things that are beyond our grasp. Right now, American people are suffering, people are hurting, cities are hurting, and it's time for action.
Yes, I would like to comment.
Go ahead.
So just looking at SNAP, the USDA can provide state SNAP agencies with the flexibility they need to operate remotely and process benefits for the increased numbers of struggling people who qualify for SNAP. We can suspend the SNAP time limits and any administration rule that will cut SNAP benefits. We should also adjust COVID-19 relief implementation policies to allow emergency SNAP allowance for households already at the maximum benefit level, as well as those below it. We should approve requests from the states for authority to use disaster SNAP, DSNAP to help respond to COVID-19, pending requests, including those from California, Michigan, and Florida. USDA should increase food access points for SNAP participants during the pandemic and allow them to purchase hot prepared foods from the SNAP retailers and work with states to greater utilize the SNAP restaurant meals program. Can I continue?
In the interest of time, and I appreciate that. You're being straightforward, and I appreciate the time. I'd like to allow other panelists to respond as well.
I will actually second the idea that, I didn't come here today to try to rewrite new legislation for you. So I can't give you a comprehensive list, although I'd be really happy to follow up with a comprehensive list of things I think you should consider. I do want to say, one of the reasons why increasing the refundability on so many of the tax credits like is done in the HEROES Act is so important is because we're trying to get money to the lowest income kids. If we think about what is the expansion of the child tax credit in the HEROES Act doing? Well, it's going to have a disproportionately positive impact on minority children because minority children disproportionately are unlikely to get the full amount of current refundable tax credits. So I do think you want to be thinking about that. I will say, since you've given me the opportunity, I'd really like to see a secondary earner tax credit on your agenda because we make it too hard for households that have two workers. And that's going to be a big problem going forward that I always want to raise this awareness. We've seen women drop from being the majority of non-farm payroll holders before this pandemic began to much lower. I don't know that that's going to come back given the pressure that's on really women, it's parents, but women to sacrifice their career right now to support the tremendous needs that their children have. It's going to be on you to try to help.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Delbaney, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for holding this very important hearing. And I want to thank all our witnesses for taking the time to be with us virtually today. It's been more than 100 days since the House passed the HEROES Act, which included several tax provisions that would provide relief to American families and to small businesses. The Senate's inaction on this bill has really been unacceptable. They called their recent bill skinny. And I'd say it also doesn't have any muscle because it doesn't meet the needs of the American people. And while the first economic impact payment was helpful for many families, it was not meant to last the 6 months it's been since people received it. So the HEROES Act included a meaningful one-year expansion of the child tax credit, making it fully refundable, increasing the amount to $3,000 per child and $3,600 for children under 6, and authorizes advanced or monthly payments. Additionally, Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy and I introduced bipartisan legislation that was included in the HEROES Act that would enhance the employee retention tax credit and make targeted improvements in order to help workers stay connected to their employer and their benefits. If the HEROES Act had been taken up by the Senate when we passed it in May, tax provisions like the child tax credit and the earned income or the employee retention tax credit would have better positioned families and small businesses to weather the economic crisis that we're facing. And I've heard from several of my constituents who've shared stories about how expansions of the child tax credit and the employee retention tax credit would be helpful for them. I've heard from many restaurants like Alexa's Cafe and Lombardi's that are being hit particularly hard during this pandemic. At the beginning of the pandemic, Lombardi's, which is a local Italian restaurant in my district, had to lay off 90% of its employees. Thanks to a PPP loan, partially reopening and adapting its business to filling a growing need for grocery services, Lombardi's been able to hire back 95% of its employees. However, the owners are hesitant to hire new employees without incentives like the employee retention tax credit. And they're currently not able to take advantage of that employee retention tax credit because they've already taken a PPP loan. The HEROES Act would change that. Shifting gears to the child tax credit, Dawn is a mother from Washington State and is currently raising her child. She says the child tax credit helps with everything from food to clothing that's needed to help her growing child. Additionally, she used the credit to make her family more financially secure. She was able to afford a needed car repair and pay off debt. But now more of the money can be dedicated to her child. But that all changed with the pandemic. Increasing the child tax credit and making payments monthly would help cover more expenses for Dawn and her child during this very difficult time. Unfortunately, experiences like Dawn's and our witness, Ms. Long's, are far too common, which is why the Senate can't wait any longer to pass the HEROES Act. Mr. Morial, I know you recently wrote a letter in support of the child tax credit provisions, and I thank you for that. Could you speak to how the child tax credit expansion in the HEROES Act would benefit working class families, particularly Black families that are currently not receiving the full benefit?
Well, but I think any expansion of the child tax credit is an excellent way to use the tax code to alleviate the effects of low wages, poverty, et cetera. And to the extent that we expand it, we create more support for families. We create support for more families. It's beneficial in these times. Let's understand what's happened in the American economy. Many, many Black families are in low-wage jobs. Many of the service sector jobs are populated by both Black and brown families, Black and brown workers. They've been laid off. Hotel workers, restaurant workers, airline workers, and they simply cannot make ends meet having been laid off. Secondly, the propensity of Black and brown, particularly young women who do not have a college education, to be in low-wage jobs, and they are mothers, would benefit greatly from an expansion of the child tax credit. So I think when we talk in these terms of these tax credits, we really need to think about the people who benefit from this, and we need to understand the large numbers of people. The American economy has not worked well for many, many people over the last 20 years. They are working, they are hustling, they are giving everything they have, and they still can't make ends meet. So to expand the child tax credit is just one way in these difficult times, but it alone is not enough. It alone is not enough.
Thank you so much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. Thank you. Now we'll go to off-committee members. Mr. Davis, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Davis?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, especially given the fact that I'm not a member of this committee. So I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to wave on, because every day I see the uneven devastation experienced by Black, brown, and indigenous communities. African Americans and Latinos make up a disproportionate share of essential workers, of those hospitalized by the virus, of those dying from the virus, and of those bracing for evictions. Many like the savings or stocks or 401ks to help make ends meet. The HEROES Act offers critical aid to help Americans get through the next 6 months. To help immediately, it offers stimulus payments so people can eat and pay rent, as well as the employee retention and paid leave credits to help small businesses keep employees. To help in the new year, it improves refundable tax credits and tax deductions to help families cover costs. The tax provisions of the HEROES Act are essential to address the economic destruction and racial disparities from this pandemic. Ms. Long, your testimony is absolutely compelling because it mirrors that of thousands of my constituents. In addition to the immediate help that a second stimulus payment would provide, the committee improved tax credits in the HEROES Act to help lower income workers get money early next year to help cover expenses like child care. These benefits could pay a few $1,000s to a working mom, a low-income worker. How could these funds help an individual like yourself, a single mom and 2 kids, as 2021 begins? So could you re-articulate what another stimulus package would really do for your family and other families like yours?
Thank you. Well, at this time that I'm facing eviction and being forced out of my home and not having any savings and just starting a new job, which means I have to work in the hole, the $1,200, based on whatever happens in court, I don't know what's going to happen in the future. It's very unknown right now. It may be a deposit for me to put my family in somewhere safe, somewhere that we can call home again and rebuild. We desperately need government action, and the $1,200 is part of the solution, but it absolutely is not the solution. You know, the oppressive systems that keep mothers, African Americans, and minorities down has to change. Right now, this is just a Band-Aid for such a bigger issue that COVID-19 has, shown us.
Thank you very much, President Morial. Mark, your testimony captures one of the key strengths of the HEROES Act tax provision. The fact that the tax provisions help individuals immediately and in the near future. Could you tell us again why it is so important to help address the economic and racial inequalities that exist in our country? And of course, we certainly appreciate the work that the Urban League and that you and the Urban League have done for so many years.
Congressman Davis, thank you for your question. And let me thank you for your leadership and for your longstanding friendship and support of the Urban League, particularly the Chicago Urban League, one of our finest affiliates in the country. It is important to understand that this COVID pandemic has unmasked pre-existing economic disparities, and we've watched them play out in many ways. Number one, currently the Black unemployment rate is twice as high as the white unemployment rate. And the Black unemployment rate has nearly tripled in the time of this pandemic. Number two, Black workers far more likely to work in those jobs for which a work from home option is not available. Therefore, they remain in harm's way, remain in risk of getting COVID in the workplace. Thirdly, many Black families Black workers are in low income jobs. So these tax credits, which are designed to assist people at the lower end of the economic spectrum, are valuable provisions in the HEROES Act.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Higgins, you're recognized for 5 minutes. You have to unmute.
How's that? Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. 192,000 Americans are dead, including 914 yesterday alone. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention estimates that up to 25,000 more Americans will be dead in the next 3 weeks because of COVID-19. The fact of the matter is the poor handling of this pandemic by the federal government is as clear as it could be. 25% of the deaths from COVID-19 are Americans globally, and with only 5% of the world's population. The world is closed to Americans and to America. Americans aren't welcomed in Canada. Americans are not welcomed in 27 European countries, and there's a reason for that. In a time of national emergency, we depend on the President of the United States, the leader of the free world, to marshal the resources of the federal government to ensure that the states, counties, and cities have the assistance, the money that they need to respond on the ground to protect the citizens that we all take an oath to try to keep safe and try to keep healthy. The United States federal government response was slow, sloppy, and adversarial. I represent an area that sits on the Canadian border, both the city of Buffalo and the city of Niagara Falls. I'm trying to get the border open with Canada. There's only one statistic that matters every single morning when they reevaluate that, and that is the number of cases that you have per 100,000 population. And we, in the United States, our COVID-19 cases are 7 times that which is in Canada today. So we need a response and we need leadership. The Senate bill, it will be 5 months tomorrow when the HEROES Act was passed on May 12th by the House of Representatives. 5 months tomorrow. We didn't say that this was a take it or leave it proposition. We said it represented a starting point, not an end point. It is the responsibility of the House to initiate appropriations bill. The bill on May 12th was an appropriations bill. There was plenty of time to negotiate something different, something better. But there was no action by the Senate. The Senate didn't have a skinny bill. Their bill was skeletal. There was nothing there. Nothing there. So when we look at the situation that we are currently in, blame rests exclusively with the President of the United States, who failed repeatedly to protect the American people. And that's where blame belongs. And we need leadership from the Senate and from the White House. We are not in an economic recovery mode. We don't have that luxury. We are still in disaster relief. And at the front end of providing that disaster relief was the states, the counties, and the cities. And this federal government has a responsibility to provide assistance to those who have borne the brunt. They've taken 2 hits on the revenue side because of the contraction of the economy, but also on the expenditure side because of the lethargic disengaged federal government in this time of national emergency. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Panetta, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. Appreciate being a part of this hearing. Thank you for allowing me. And thanks to obviously all our witnesses who have taken the time to prepare for this, to be here, but also all of your service as well. I think, look, I think it's obvious based on what we're hearing. One moment. Sorry about that. It's obvious based on what we're hearing that I think we all know that millions of Americans are out of work. I think it's clear. Just this week, I think we saw close to 900,000 filed for unemployment and benefits. And here in California, along with the wildfires that we're all experiencing, on the unemployment rate is nearly 15%. That's almost twice as much as the national average of 8%. For those workers, they're no longer, those who are at work, there's no longer the additional unemployment benefits, and the direct disbursements from the CARES Act clearly have been spent. I think we all understand that. And where I come from and where I represent proudly on the Central Coast of California, where tourism is a main industry and hospitality is a central industry, those workers who work in that economy are facing severe consequences. Well, don't get me wrong, some sectors of our economy have experienced rebounds. I think we're seeing that slowly. Jobs continue to be permanently lost in the restaurant, and the hotel, and the travel industries, which really are a key part of our culture and our economy here on the Central Coast. And unfortunately, you're seeing, especially the independent restaurants, the independent-owned small businesses are closing permanently every single day. We're seeing news reports of that. And we know that their workers will not have a job to go back to when those, and so some workers won't be able to go back to not only those businesses, but other businesses as well, that when they're able to reopen, if possible. Now, we're relying here, as we have, on CalFresh SNAP benefits and, of course, our food banks to temporarily help those workers and their families. But I think we know, and we've heard on this hearing, that we got to expand those benefits. And yes, there are moratoriums on preventing a mass wave of evictions, but when they won't run out, we know the rent's still due. Now, people of color, unfortunately, are facing the greatest burdens. Not only have we heard that on this hearing, we're seeing it in my district. We're reading about it all across this country. The employment rate for Black workers has fallen by less than 4 percentage points since April, only 4 percentage points. And for undocumented immigrants whose communities have experienced high rate of COVID-19 transmission and who were excluded from the economic impact payments from the CARES Act, we got to ensure that they're provided support as well. Those are my constituents. They're your constituents for members on this call, and they need all of our help. And that includes the support from the HEROES Act that was passed well over 100 days ago and needs to be passed right now. Now, look, as we heard, hunger is affecting many families in my district and all across this country. Our food banks are overwhelmed. One of the things that I'm proud that I get to do, and what I get to do this afternoon is actually what I have been doing and get to do this afternoon right after this call, is go out and help distribute food. One, because it's a break from these damn Zoom calls, which we're all getting sick of. But two, it's actually my opportunity to see what's going out there on the ground. But unfortunately, I also get to see the lines getting longer and longer. Mr. Colicchio, let me direct my questions at you in my limited time. Talk to me about how the direct disbursements, the direct benefits, like the unemployment insurance, like the $1,200, like the expanded SNAP benefits, how could those reduce those long lines that I'm seeing at our food banks?
Well, because thanks for the question, if you put money into the pockets of people who are most affected, they will actually, instead of going and waiting on lines in a food bank, they'll go to the supermarket and spend that money. Now, it was mentioned earlier that for every dollar that is spent through the SNAP program, it actually stimulates the economy to about $1.80. All that money actually goes back into the economy. It goes to supermarkets, it goes to bodegas, it goes to farm stands and the like. And so it does a great job of stimulating the economy. And while you were on it, I want to kind of touch on something else that you mentioned. You talked about restaurants. I'm in the restaurant business. independent restaurants employ 11 million people. There are estimates that between 70% to 80% of all restaurants, independent restaurants in this country, will close. That will affect about 8 million people. 8 million jobs that will not come back. And so besides what we're focused on today, we have the Restaurants Act that is also written by a colleague of yours in Ways and Means, Congressman Blumenauer, also written in the Senate by Roger Wicker from Mississippi, and we need support. And I know I'm going outside of today's hearing, but 11 million jobs are on the line. And without help, those jobs will not come back. And so I'm not an economist, but I'm a business owner. And I can tell you right now, the struggles of every single restaurateur, independent restaurateur in this country, they're real. And as Mr. Morial pointed out, a lot of those jobs are held by Black and brown people and people who are going to be affected disproportionately than most workers. And we can't do this work at home.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Murphy, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to wave onto your subcommittee today and to participate in this hearing. I think what we see every single day on news and headlines can numb us to the actual pain and suffering that our constituents and businesses face each day. But I think it's really important that we keep fighting for more relief for the American people. And doing nothing isn't the right policy or strategy as people lose their jobs, they get sick, or they go hungry. And I appreciate all the witnesses making time to be with us today and helping us be bring more awareness to the cost and consequences of congressional inaction. As many of my colleagues have said, pointed out, the House passed the HEROES Act back in May. It wasn't a perfect bill, but was intended to start the legislative process, except for it didn't. For 4 months, the Senate did absolutely nothing, even though COVID was exploding in Florida and across the country. And the senators had said, they wanted to wait and see. And let me tell you what I saw. In my hometown of Orlando, where we are heavily dependent on high-touch industries like tourism and hospitality, where the pandemic affects us disproportionately, what I saw was people losing their jobs, with pockets of my community with over 15% unemployment, with Florida holding steady at 15% COVID positivity rate for weeks during the summer, leading to endless hospitalizations and deaths. I've seen businesses that have been strongholds in my community for decades shutter their doors because the initial resources ran out and they saw no other choice. I've seen hungry families flood food banks. I've seen families who couldn't afford to stay in their homes find themselves living in makeshift housing with squalid conditions. I've seen children go back to school in person without sufficient resources, and staff and students getting infected and having to quarantine. So as this hearing shows, and what too many of my constituents know too well because they're living it every day right now, there are some real consequences to American families and American business of this inaction in Congress. And I think what needs to happen now is for leaders of the House, the Senate, and the White House to lock themselves in a room and make a deal. And I led a letter from the Blue Dog Coalition saying exactly this. Look, there are differences between the House HEROES Act and the Senate HEALS Act and the most recent Senate skinny bill. But there's also a lot of common ground that we can build on, including significant agreements on tax provisions. And one of the few ideas that has managed to demonstrate bipartisan support is the expansion of the Employee Retention Tax Credit, which is in both the HEROES and the HEALS Act. And with support from your staff, Mr. Chairman, and the committee, I'm really proud to have led that charge on making sure the ERTC made it into the CARES Act. And the current ERTC is a good start, but it's nowhere near sufficient to match the needs of employers and employees across this country. And I introduced, alongside Rep. Delbeni, as she mentioned earlier, an expanded ERTC that was in the HEROES Act. The purpose of the ERTC is to encourage businesses and organizations of all sizes, because a job is a job is a job, businesses of all sizes to retain their employees by providing a tax credit against payroll taxes. This is a bipartisan and proven tool that keeps employers, that helps employers keep workers on payroll so that they can continue to receive an income and employer-sponsored health insurance, which is critically important. It also keeps them from having to deal with the onerous unemployment system. And keeping people connected to their jobs ensures that both employers and employees are better positioned to resume normal operations once the pandemic ends. JCT has estimated that close to 6 million firms and 60 million American workers would be impacted with an expanded ERTC, the majority of those small and medium-sized businesses. And I've heard from businesses large and small, such as Disney or my local brewery in Winter Park, that an expanded ERTC would be critical to keeping people on payroll. And it also enjoys support from over 140 industry associations, ranging from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to the Small Business Roundtable, as well as 3,800 nonprofit organizations. The ERTC is just one example, but there are so many provisions that the House, the Senate, and the White House can agree on that would save lives and businesses, such as resources for schools, incentives for clean reopening, resources for our healthcare community. The ingredients for a bipartisan compromise are there. Congressional leadership and the administration just need to put politics aside and help people. We can't let the perfect become the enemy of the good. The reality is we are working in a divided government. And so principled compromise is necessary. People are hurting and our economy is suffering, and we need to act, and we need to act now. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Murphy. Your time has expired. To all of our witnesses,
I'm going to have to excuse myself, sir, for another call. I want to thank the committee for having me today.
Thank you. To all of our witnesses, thank you very much for joining us today. And please be advised that members have 2 weeks to submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. Mr. Smith, did you have something to say?
Yeah, I ask unanimous consent to speak for 1 minute.
Without objection.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I just want to add emphasis to the fact that now is the time we need to work together. We need to come together. We've heard some, I think, some constructive testimony here today from both sides. And I think now more than ever, probably in the history of our country, we need to come together to focus on solutions. We have a lot of folks who want to arrive at a deal. Let's head in that direction and be responsible with taxpayer resources, and at the same time, find a good solution, get our country back on track economically. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. And I don't think you have any disagreement from any members on this committee. We all want to work together. We all want to find a solution that helps our constituents and helps our country. Much has been said about the negotiation process, and there's probably a little bit of truth in everything that has been said. But the fact remains that the House passed the HEROES Act over 100 days ago. And the Senate came back just this week and passed a bill that they say is the skinny bill, whatever that means. What I know that it does mean is it means they passed a bill with no idle grant provisions for small businesses, no guardrails for the PPP program to ensure that small businesses, family-owned businesses get the help they need and not the big wealthy corporations that took advantage of that program before. No help for restaurants, no help for state and local government, no EIP, economic impact payment provisions. Their skinny bill was a joke. And we do need to work together. We do need to find a solution. But the fact is the process needs to move forward. And this hearing, I believe, really showcased the need for that. We need to be able to pass a bill that helps our constituents and the country. So thank you all. And with that, the subcommittee stands adjourned.
Will the gentleman yield?